As we've talked about the brokenness of our present day, one of the things that people repeatedly are talking about in complete agreement is that we're having a deep issue when it comes to human relationships. Whether you talk about how the Surgeon General a number of years ago called this an epidemic of loneliness and saying it is causing real health issues. Another statistic I was reading was saying that the number of men who say they have no friends whatsoever has quintupled, a factor of 5 over one generation. Or we could even speak about how in just the span of 6 years, all this before COVID, 2012 to 2018, the number of teenage girls who expressed a deep feeling of loneliness doubled. These are distressing numbers, and it shows that there is something broken, something fractured about how we as humans are relating to each other. And what I want to suggest is what we can understand, if we want to understand what is going on, we would do worse than starting at what we just mentioned, this description of the life of Tertius. Because in this snapshot, I think we see two different forces that lie near the heart of things. There is the force that we see within the Roman Empire of making people less human, less like persons. We could call it this tendency to thingify, to render people into things. That's one way. But then we also see this second way, the way of Jesus, which is the way of recognition of humanity. And we're going to specifically identify this with this act that we see in our passage, the way we might call it of the holy kiss. The way of thingifying and the way of the holy kiss. That is what I'd like us to consider this morning. First, the way of thingifying. There is a philosopher by the name of Simone Weil who says we should be attentive to a power that is at work in this world, a power that I think I would call demonic, a force or a tendency to render persons into things. There is a very easy, obvious way where that can happen in a very literal sense. When someone is killed, they are no longer a person, they have become a corpse, they are now a thing. But Weil points out that there are ways that a person can remain living and still be essentially, at least in society's eyes, a thing. And the most obvious example of this is what we've already mentioned, is slavery. A person is now named just 3 and treated like a number. That is to thingify, to make them less a person in our eyes. But it doesn't even need something as severe as slavery for that power to be at work. Just think for a moment, if you ever get an email from someone who's not a close friend, but someone has some connection to your life that makes you angry. Have you ever had this? You're like looking at it on your phone or the computer screen, and you're starting to feel this activated sense of rage. How would you start thinking of the person in your mind? If you're anything like me, the temptation is just to reduce them, is to make them into nothing more than someone who's just this foolish person, this jerk. You don't think of them as a person who has a mother, a person who has a life. You just think of them in a really reduced way. In our anger, our temptation is to thingify. What we're doing here in some ways is just riffing on something that Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount. You might remember, if you know the Sermon on the Mount, that Jesus, as he's talking about God's commandments, says that when God says you shall not murder, he's not just talking about killing. Jesus says, I tell you the truth, even if someone who in their anger calls someone raka, meaning moron, or who calls someone fool, he is guilty before God of violating this commandment. Because what he has done is he has reduced the person. He has made them less human. He has thingified them. Jesus says there is something deeply dishonoring to God when we take someone who is a human being made in God's image, and in our minds we begin to treat them like a thing. And the thing that I find distressing as I think about this is that in many different small ways, our culture has made it easier and easier to see people as things, and harder to see and to recognize people as persons. So what do I mean by that? Well, let me just try a few different examples and see if you can see what I'm talking about. So here's something small, but I think it's an example. A few days ago, I was shopping online for a shirt, just needing a new white shirt. And I came on this website, and I didn't see just the shirt by itself, of course. I saw a person kind of like looking like this with a beard and, cool hair and in his 50s. I don't know this person, didn't even think of him as a person. To me, he was an image. If I had bought this shirt, I certainly wouldn't have thought about how this shirt, the fabric, was made by likely a factory in China with many workers who were there 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, making sure that it was woven right, it was dyed right. I certainly wouldn't think about the people who were going to be involved in transport, the person delivery. All I would think about was that one day I would see this plastic package on my door. And if I think of people at all I'm doing is thinking of them essentially as just kind of drones or glorified workers. I don't think of them as human beings. That's a small thing. I realize that. But think of how that story is repeated 1,000 times a year for many of us. What does it do about the way we think of people when that is what's common for us? Or think of the language that we just use. Economists talk about human capital. Many businesses have a human resources department. This is language that suggests that what we have here is just kind of a commodity that we should strategically utilize for economic growth. We don't have persons. Or think even on your phone, like if you are searching for a phone number, where do you search? It's not people, it's contacts. Have you ever thought about the difference? People are describing who they are. Contacts are what they can do for you. We're seeing them as something less. We're reducing them. Think of how social media works. If you are interacting with someone on social media, especially if they're not very close to you, and you get involved in discussion, maybe a disagreement, it's not the same as if you're having a face-to-face conversation, is it? If I'm talking to someone face-to-face, they have, from what I understand, over 40 different facial muscles, and there's so many different subtleties. There's the, I kind of think this, but I'm not sure of it. That gets completely reduced on social media. All I see are a few bytes represented by words, maybe a like or down, and a face. That's not a person I'm interacting with anymore, and my mind starts thinking of them as just nothing more than their opinion. We're thingifying. I mean, even the most intimate things about humanity, we see this happening. I mean, what is pornography other than objectifying someone for the sake of someone else's desires? When we speak of a child in the womb, we increasingly speak of a fetus or an embryo, which allows us to speak of this as an it rather than a he or a she. And again, I'm not trying to point at one thing and say, that's bad, that's bad, that's bad. My point is that when you put this collectively and you think of all of these things, it becomes clear that it's harder and harder for us to recognize the personhood, the humanity of all these people who are involved in our lives. And it's easier and easier for us to think of them as things. We thingify. And if we take a step back, it's not hard for us to understand why all of these different little advances keep moving us in this direction, because it's easier. I mean, we want privacy. We want independence, which are different ways of just speaking of being disconnected from other persons, right? And we want that because the moment that we see a person and that person sees us, there is a vulnerability we experience. We have to suddenly wonder, what do they think of us? What might they say about us? We understand this because to actually see someone as a person takes energy. It is inefficient. It is not easy. And at a deep level, if we actually look at someone in the face and see them, there is something in us that I think that recognizes that we have a responsibility to that person. We have a responsibility to love that person. So Jesus, when he is talking about what it means to follow God, he talks about the way that we love God is by loving our neighbor as ourselves. And in one conversation like this, a person who perhaps was threatened by this idea says, but who is my neighbor? In other words, Who do I have to treat like a human being, and who can I treat as less? And in answer to that question, Jesus tells the story, as you might remember, of the Good Samaritan, a story of a man who finds someone on the road, beaten, stripped, robbed, and he kneels down and he helps him. And the point is that the neighbor is the one that God puts along your path, that the human being that you encounter, that's your neighbor. That's the one you're called to love. But if you know the story, you will know that before this interaction, there were two other people, a priest and a Levite, people who were pious in that day, who when they saw from afar that person who was beaten and robbed and naked, they kept a distance. And I think it's because if you get close and you see the person, then you realize you should do something. And it's costly. It cost the Samaritan quite a bit. And so rather than doing that, it was just simpler to keep them at a distance, to not think much about him, and to keep going because it's easier. And if you think about it in 1,000 different ways, that is what our society has come to. In so many different ways, we have preserved anonymity. We have allowed disconnection. We have allowed ourselves to have less understanding of each other's humanity because it's easier. But it comes at a cost. We were made to recognize each other. We were made to be recognized by each other. The very first thing when a baby is born that they look for is another face that looks and sees them. We were made to love others and to be loved. That is core to who we are. And every one of these things that allows us to be disconnected, that allows us to be thingified, robs that of our lives. And that is why we are lonely. That's why we feel isolated. This is the way of thingifying.